Well, today is the day we celebrate Mother's Day. And so let me just begin by saying Happy Mother's Day. We're so thankful for who you are and what you do. Your role is so significant. But in honor of Mother's Day, we're going to look at an ordinary woman who becomes an ordinary mother, and yet because of her faithfulness, God uses her in extraordinary ways. We're going to look at the story of Ruth, but we're going to do things just a little bit different today. We're going to hear the story as if it was told by a city leader in this little sleepy town called Bethlehem. And we're going to listen to the story as it was told by somebody who participated in these events 3,000 years ago.
Shalom, shalom. That's how we really greet each other back where I'm from. If my research is correct, here in Idaho, you say, boy howdy, which seems a little strange to me. But shalom actually means peace, and we do say it coming or going. But if you ask me, if somebody says shalom to you, it's kind of rude for you not to answer back. And so I'm going to give you one more shot at it. Shalom. Shalom. I am one of the elders in a little town called Bethlehem. Bethlehem's just a sleepy little spot. In fact, you really shouldn't even call it a city. It's just a blip on the map. It's about 9 miles south of Jerusalem. You've probably heard of Jerusalem. But as one of the elders in the city gate, we made it a practice to actually meet there at the city gate. You see, the city gate is the lifeblood of any town. Bethlehem's just a small little blip. I said that, but really the city walls are only about 12 miles. The 12 acres, I think, in your language. And so a small little place and one little set of doors to go in and out. And so if you're working, you got to go outside the city. And so if you're going to go out to the fields, you have to pass by the city gate. Now, the merchants, they would get up early and they'd come to the city gate because that's where all the comings and goings are. And so they'd set up their shop there, if you will, at the city gate. And so if you want to find somebody, you go to the city gate. As leaders, that's where we did our business, because if you needed someone, they were always there. If you needed a witness, you could find one. And if the people needed to find us, they know where to find us. And so the lifeblood, the city gate, I knew everybody because the comings and goings. But just a small town, really pretty insignificant. Nothing really ever happened in Bethlehem, at least in my day. But there is one story in this sleepy little town that maybe might be of interest. It might be of interest to you. It's a story of this lady, just an ordinary lady, but a lady who became known for chesed. Now, I'm going to have you say this word, chesed. And so can you try that? Chesed. It's important for our story. See, the interesting thing about chesed is it's hard to translate into your language. It's a word that sometimes I know people say it's loving kindness or faithfulness, but it really is a word about covenant loyalty. It's about devoted love. In fact, the kind of love that would even give oneself up for another person. In fact, there's no higher honor in my language than to say a person is a person of chesed. It's so rare that actually this word, it's used of God all the time. But the highest compliment that could be paid to a good Jew was that he was a person of chesed. Now, in your Bible, it's used about 500 times of God. On a very rare occasion, it might be used of a good Jewish man. But this word would never be used of a woman, except there's once. One woman of which this word is used. But to really tell the story, I've got to give you some background. You see, my day and age was a dark period in Israel's history. My story takes place in the time of the judges. Now, I don't know about your rabbi, or how do you say that in English? Teacher. Maybe he's told you a little bit about the judges. But it was a dark day in Israel's history. You see, everybody did what they saw fit in their own eyes. It was a day of moral relativism where people said, you can do what you want. If it feels good, do it. You're your own boss. And that's what people did. They turned their back on God. In fact, in my day and age, they really kind of abandoned the law of Moses. Even the 10 Commandments, maybe you've heard of those. They took them out of the public square. They did what they saw fit in their own eyes. They lived by their own standard, and it was dark days. Because of that,
There was all kinds of crime. There was all kinds of poverty. There was all kinds of homelessness. People were just doing their own things, even alternate lifestyles, because they had abandoned the principles of God. It was a dark day. The laws of God, not in the public square. And because of that, actually calamity hit my nation several times. There was a cycle that we constantly went through because we weren't very smart. You see, we'd turn our back on God. And when we turned our back on God, it left us open to attacks from the outside. And so God would really even send in invading armies, and they would overtake our country. And during that, there were times of servitude. There was great poverty. And often it was also a time of famine and pestilence in the land. Well, usually it'd take a while, but then people would kind of start repenting of their sin. They'd start praying again to God. And God would send a deliverer to come and rescue. And when that deliverer came, God would restore the prosperity of the land. And there'd be times of peace. But here's what happened in my days. It was a cycle that was spiraling downward, where people, they really forgot God. And those cycles became quicker and quicker and more intense. It was a terrible time when people were just doing whatever they wanted, when people forgot God. But in the midst of that, there was one woman who showed covenant faithfulness. One woman who showed this loyalty, a willingness to give of herself. And what's interesting is this lady wasn't even a Jew. But I'm getting a little ahead of my story. It was during one of those dark times when the nation was being oppressed, God also sent this severe famine in the land. It was bad. And as one of the city leaders, it was hard to give direction to this small little community. And one of the men, the greatest man in our community, his name was Elimelech. He decided to leave. Now, I understand, I realize a man's got to take care of his family. And it was a time of extreme poverty. What's interesting is our little burg, Bethlehem, means house of bread. And yet even in the house of bread, there was no grain. And so Elimelech left. Now, we understand that. You got to take care of your family. But Elimelech did not just leave Bethlehem. He left Israel. Now, you need to kind of put on a different mindset maybe. I know that you guys, you move all the time. And you move all across your country. And I know that you call your country one nation under God. But you need to put things in perspective. We're Israel. We were God's nation. And for a person to be a Jew meant they believed that the promised land was, well, the promised land. This is God's land. And Elimelech not only decided that he was going to leave Bethlehem, he was going to leave Israel, God's promised land. I want to tell you, that didn't sit well with the city leaders or most of the people. And in fact, we got pretty mad at Elimelech, especially because he not only wanted to leave the promised land, he wanted to go to Moab. How do I explain Moab to you? I don't know if do you tell Montana jokes or Wyoming jokes? They do about you, just letting you know. We told Moabite jokes. In fact, there's a great Moabite joke. Do you hear about the two Moabite? Oh, I better not tell that story. We're in church. Anyway, we made jokes of Moab, but not just objects of our ridicule. We hated the Moabites. You see, they were the oppressors in Israel. We had a long, dark, standing history with them, and they would come in and they would conquer us. They were not just the objects of our ridicule. They were scorned. And Elimelech, he's going to go to Moab. I want to tell you, I had a few not-so-kosher words for him. Moab? Well, interesting thing is, Elimelech, do you know what Elimelech means? His name actually means, my God is king. And my God and king is king. He thumbed his nose at God and he went to Moab. And so it was not a pretty day. Well, I've got to tell you, things didn't work out so well for him. The grass is not always greener on the other side of the ravine, we used to say. Moab is not a good place, and Elimelech's going there. He takes his wife along with him, of course, a very nice gal. Her name's Naomi. Actually, her name means pleasant.
And they've got two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. I've got to stop and say, they were born and they were raised during this time of famine, and they were kind of frail little kids. I've got to believe that they really didn't get quite enough sustenance while they were in their mama's cooker, if you know what I mean, during this time of famine. A little more falafel to fatten them up would be good. Frail little boys, but he takes his family, Naomi and his sons, and they move to Moab, and things do not work out well. In fact, how do you say it in your language? I think they outstruck. No, that's not quite right. I think they struck out. Here's why. They get to Moab, and as soon as they get to Moab, Elimelech dies. Naomi becomes a widow in a foreign land. Now, you need to understand, there was no, I forgot the word. It's that SS thing. There was no... to take care of people. There was no, what's the word? Social Security. There was no Social Security. You see, widows, they were forgotten, or worse, widows were taken advantage of. And things were not good. Well, not only that, we have Elimelech dying, but those two boys, they married foreigners. They married Moabite women. Now, strike two. You need to realize God's people were not supposed to marry foreigners. Now, there was some dialogue about whether that was just people living in the promised land, or if you lived outside of the promised land, if you could marry a foreigner. But I've got to tell you, the reason God put that in place is because he didn't want his people to be infected or influenced by other nations and their worship of false gods. And these ladies that they marry, that's what they do. They worship false gods, and yet these two boys, they marry those women who worship other gods. And yet, that's not all that happens. We get strike three. Mahlon and Chilion, they die as well. And so here's Naomi, and here's this daughter-in-law called Ruth, and also another daughter named Orpha. Now, don't be saying Oprah, a different lady. And so we get three widows living in Moab. And again, none of this Social Security. Now, realize this, that not only are widows forgotten or abused, but if they were back in the promised land, God had provision for situations like this. You see, here's how God provided for widows. First of all, you need to understand that God has this law set in place that goes like this: honor your father and mother, so your days will be long upon this earth. Do you know what that's talking about? It's actually when your parents get older, you should take care of them. And here's the promise: if you take care of your parents and you show respect for them, that when you get old, your kids will also take care of you, and so your days can be long on this earth. And so God had a provision set in place. Children, take care of your parents, honor your parents. But Naomi's children had died. That's okay, because God had another provision really in place. The provision goes like this, that the provision's one called a kinsman redeemer. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later, but if a widow died and she had no children of her own, the man who died, his brother had responsibility, and he could become the kinsman redeemer, or maybe another brother, or even a distant relative could help take care of the widow. But here's the problem. Elimelech died. He had no brothers. In fact, Naomi really couldn't even think of any relatives of Elimelech. And so God's provisions aren't working out so well, except God still provided for his people in yet another way. If she was living in the promised land, there was a system called gleaning. Now, gleaning is simply this: that when you go and harvest your fields, you're not supposed to harvest the outside edge of your field. You're supposed to leave that there. And people maybe destitute, they could come and they could pick the grain or the harvest from the edge of the field.
And not only that, but as you're harvesting, if something drops to the ground, you're not supposed to pick it up. You're supposed to leave it there. And so people could come and they could glean from the fields and they could provide for themselves. Now, the law was this: if a person doesn't work, they don't eat. And so they had to go out and they had to do the work of collecting and gathering and gleaning from the fields. But understand, God had provision for people. They could be taken care of. They'd make the initiative. Now, again, if somebody was incapable of doing that, there were other principles involved in God's law. But for those people who were capable of working, God's provision was let them work and let others allow them the opportunity to work. And so if Naomi was in the promised land, there was provision from God's law. But guess what? She's not. She's in Moab. And she's got 2 daughters-in-law. Now, in my day and age, we used to tell mother-in-law jokes. In fact, do you still tell mother-in-law jokes? There's a great one. There's this one mother. Oh, I better not tell that either. But here's Naomi and 2 daughters-in-law. What are they to do? And about the same time, Naomi starts hearing about the fact that Israel has been restored. They've had a deliverer. And the pestilence and the famine of the land, God is now blessing the land, and that famine has been removed. And so things are going well back in her homeland. And so what does she do? Now, she maybe could invite her daughters-in-law to go with her, but remember, they're foreigners. They worship another god. She has no children. She has no sons that she could marry off these ladies to, which is part of God's plan. These ladies would probably be abused, ridiculed, mocked, scorned if they went back to Israel. So what does she do? She actually takes her daughters-in-law aside and says, I have no children. I can't promise you anything. In fact, I'm destitute. We're going to go back and glean off the land. It would be better for you to actually go and return, interestingly enough, she says, to your mother's house. Maybe there's someone that can marry you there. At least the family unit can take care of you. And so after much crying and some tears and some long goodbyes, Orpah actually returns back home. But not Ruth. And here's where the story gets interesting. This foreigner, this Moabite, actually practiced chesed. Her loyal faithfulness, her covenant relationship with her mother-in-law drives her to say something becomes famous in our parts. Ruth actually looks at her mother-in-law and says, don't urge me to leave you and turn back from you. Where you go, I'm going to go. And where you stay, I'm going to stay. And your people will be my people. And your God will be my God. In fact, I'll even go and be buried with you. You see, Ruth, out of covenant faithfulness to her mother-in-law, decides she's going to abandon her own people. She's going to abandon the practice that she practiced of worshiping foreign gods. And Ruth is going to be completely committed to Naomi, even though it means going back and probably being destitute in a land where she would be ridiculed, a land where she's going to look different, a land where really people aren't going to accept her. But she decides to go and stay with her mother-in-law. I remember the day it happened. I'm a city leader at the city gates when there's a great big commotion going on. Now, I've got to tell you, I thought it was another one of those stable sales. What do you call them here? Garage sales. I mean, people were hustling about, doing all kinds of things. I thought, there's excitement going on. Somebody's got a good sale. And all of a sudden at a distance, I see the reason for the excitement. We lived in a sleepy town. Not much happens. And across the distance, I see someone that I recognize, although weathered and looking much older now. I recognize who it is. It's Naomi. And there with Naomi is this young gal with her. And so I cry out, Naomi, Naomi. And she looks at me and says, don't call me Naomi. Remember, Naomi means pleasant. She says, don't call me Naomi. When I left here, I was full, but now I'm empty. Call me Mara, which means bitter. Well, it's interesting that the ladies really were destitute. But Ruth shows this chesed. She decides she's going to go out and she's going to make their way in this community. She does so by going out and starting gleaning in the fields. Now understand, the law of Israel allows for Israelites. But there's no telling how a Moabite is going to be treated. But she decides and takes it upon herself that she's going to go out and she's going to glean and she's going to make her way. And so she goes out to a field. Now, it just so happens by chance, she happens to go to a field of a man named Boaz. Boaz. How do I explain Boaz to you? Boaz, his name means strength with speed, swift strength. But maybe there's a better way to describe him. He's got lots of fields and he's got lots of workers. I probably should also say he's single. But even more than that, you might describe him as, well, could I say he was the Joe Simplot of our day? But not only was he wealthy, I've got to tell you, his bowels gushed. Oh, that probably doesn't translate well. He had a big heart. Well, he notices one day out in his field, he notices Ruth, a Moabite. But it's interesting that as he watches her and he hears a story, it's a small sleepy town, he hears a story about what Ruth had done for her mother-in-law, his heart is touched. In fact, he actually goes out to Ruth and says, Ruth, tomorrow you can come back to my field and you can glean here again. I've got to stop and I've got to kind of explain that to you. You see, the rules of gleaning were pretty specific. You could go to one field on one day, but you had to go to a different place the next day. In fact, it shouldn't even be a place close by. You need to go to somebody else's field and glean there. And that way, one field wasn't, or one landowner wasn't responsible for the same person over and over again. And so they were supposed to go to different places. But he goes back to her and he says, you can glean here again tomorrow. And by the way, you can help yourself to the water cooler. And you know what? You don't really need to confine yourself to the outskirts, or you don't need to go and just pick stuff off the ground. You can actually be right along with my workers, and you can harvest directly from the field. Of course, this touched Ruth. And Ruth is really amazed that she's a foreigner, and yet Boaz is showing this kindness to her, this man of swift strength. And so she actually says, Boaz, why are you doing this? And Boaz simply responds, I've been told about you and about what you've done, your kindness to your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and how you left your lands, and you came to a place that you did not know before. May the Lord repay you with the same kind of kindness. Interestingly, he talks about the kindness of God, the chesed, the covenant faithfulness. May God repay you with his kindness, the same extent that you've shown kindness to other people. And so may God bless you, and you can come back here and take refuge. And Ruth does. And by the way, Boaz goes and he tells all his employees, look, make it easy for her. Let her glean right among you, and no more Moabite jokes. And so Ruth actually comes back a second day, and she's able to glean. She's able to glean so much that she really takes in days and days worth of provision. And she's touched by that. She actually she goes home with an overabundance. And she says to Naomi, her mother-in-law, look what your God has done for us. And by the way, the man that's helped us, his name's Boaz. And Naomi, she gets excited. I've got to tell you, she gets excited not just because there's all this food there. She gets excited not just because, hey, there's something going on here maybe between Boaz and Ruth. But she gets excited for this reason. Boaz, she now remembers that's a distant relative. And the wheels start spinning in her mind. You see, I've got to go back to this thing of kinsman redeemer again. Kinsman redeemer, the law went like this. If a man dies and he has a brother, that brother has a responsibility to the wife. And if not him, the next brother. But the problem is Elimelech has no brothers. But in that case, the law goes like this. If there's another distant relative, if he wants to, he can come along and he can redeem them. Doesn't have to, but he could. And so now all of a sudden, Ruth is thinking, hey, there is somebody in line. Maybe Boaz. Hesed. And she gets really excited. Not only that, she's thinking grandchildren, and that does something to a lady. She comes up with a plan. Now, I've got to stop and I've got to tell you, Boaz has been thinking too. Boaz has been thinking and planning about Ruth. He's seen that she's a hard worker. He's seen that she's, attractive. He's also known that she's demonstrated this loving kindness, this commitment, this faithfulness in a way that is certainly not expected, especially in a day and age when, everybody just did what was right in their own eyes. People that abandoned God's practices. Here's a woman who's not even a Jew that's showing covenant faithfulness. So he's thinking too. Naomi concocts this plan. Here's what Ruth is supposed to do. It's harvest time. The barley harvest is in full swing, and there's this place. How do I say it in English? It's a high point on a hill, and there's this floor there, and they take the grain. It's called, I can't remember how you say it. Oh, it's called a threshing floor. Now, you need to understand something about a threshing floor. Here's Naomi's advice to Ruth. You need to go to the threshing floor, and while they're at the threshing floor, while they're laying down, you need to go and you need to sit at Boaz's feet, and you need to say, "Can I be covered by your blanket?" And that may seem really strange to you. But here's what happens. It's during the barley harvest. And during the barley harvest, you take your barley up there and you throw the grain up in the air, and all the chaff is blown away and the grain comes back down. But at the threshing floor, you've got to wait for a couple things. You've got to wait for wind. You've also got to wait for your turn. Everybody's harvesting their barley. They come to this place, and so there's lots of people there, and they're hanging out there waiting for the wind and waiting for their turn. And so there's lots of people, and they're there early in the morning. They're there late at night. Lots of people. And Naomi's advice to Ruth is this. You go and you sit at his feet, and you ask, "Can I come under your blanket?" She's actually saying, "I would like to be a servant, and I'd like your covering. I'd like your protection." She's actually saying, "Boaz, I will come and be your slave. I'll be your servant." And Boaz actually responds, "Oh, the Lord bless you." This has said, and here's the only place you're going to find in Scripture. Your only time in Scripture, you're going to find this used of a woman. But it's not just used of a woman. It's used of a Moabite woman. Boaz realizes, here's a woman, even though she's not a Jew, even though she's a woman. Here's a person that God's using mightily, and she has demonstrated better than anyone else what true faithfulness, loving kindness, commitment to covenant looks like. The ability to think beyond themselves and say, "I will give myself completely to you," even if it's a mother-in-law. Here's a lady who's demonstrated God's kindness towards us. Here's a woman who's living out in her life Hesed. And he says, "The Lord bless you. Your Hesed is greater than that's what you have even shown earlier. You've not run after younger men, rich or poor. I'll do whatever you ask. I'm going to go to my townsmen. I'm going to say, you are a woman of noble character, and I'd like to take you as my wife." Oh, here's where it gets fun. Boaz, a man of swift strength, he comes immediately to the city gates to find the elders of the city there. And I've got to tell you, none of us would have thought anything of it if Boaz would have simply said, I'd like to redeem Ruth. But Boaz is a man of noble character. And he realizes he actually is a distant relative, but he's not the closest relative. And Elimelech had land, and that land could be passed down to a kinsman redeemer, but Elimelech had no sons. But a closest relative could redeem that land. And so he actually goes and he brings in the next closest relative. And he tells the whole story. Hey, you remember Elimelech. Of course, I'm related to Elimelech. Now, you remember that Elimelech had land here and he had supplies here. Yes, of course, I remember that. Well, you're next in line. You can redeem that. And the man says, I'd love to redeem that. Who doesn't want more land? And Boaz is disheartened. He'd become pretty excited. And then he thinks, now remember, if you get the land, that means you take care of Naomi, the deceased man's wife. Well, of course, that's expected. Now you remember also that not only is there Naomi, but there's this Moabite that you also will be responsible to. At which point the man has second thoughts and he says, I don't want to go there. And so Boaz is as quick as he can think. He takes off his sandal and he hands it to the elders. And you think, he did what? Yeah, he took off his sandal and he handed it to the elders. How come you have puzzled looks on your face? Oh, maybe I need to explain this too. You see, that's the way that we do contracts in my day. Maybe it's a little crude, especially in a day before odor eaters. But that's what you do as a sign of the contract. You take off your sandal and you exchange that. It's your commitment, your vow. You're giving a piece of property and saying, here is my commitment. I give my sandal, and he redeems Naomi, and he redeems Ruth. And it's interesting that in an ordinary little town, just a little blip on the map, a place called Bethlehem, and a very ordinary woman, and not even an Israelite, a Moabite, makes an extraordinary difference. In fact, Boaz and Ruth get married. She'd been childless for 10 years, even previously married. But Boaz and Ruth, the saying goes that God opened up her womb. And she gives birth to a child, a son. And his name is Obed, God's faithfulness. And by the way, Obed gets married and he has a son, and his name is Jesse. And Jesse gets married and he has a son, and his son actually becomes king from this little tiny blurb, this place called Bethlehem. We get King David. And it's just amazing. In a day and age where everyone did what was right in their own eyes. In a day and in a time in a land where people just did what they saw fit, and they abandoned God and they abandoned his principles, and they took the 10 Commandments and they discarded those. They just did what was evil in the sight of God. Even God's nation, a place that was founded by God on his principles, they turned their back on him. And yet God didn't turn his back on them. God was still working out his plan even in the darkest days of Israel. But he takes someone, a Moabite woman, and takes an ordinary woman and does something extraordinary. You see, that's the kind of people God uses. People of chesed. People of covenant faithfulness, of devoted love. People are saying, I'm willing to give my everything. And God can take those kind of peoples and do extraordinary things. And I've got to tell you, chesed, it's hard to practice when everyone's looking out for themselves. It's hard to practice when everybody's doing their own thing. It's hard to practice in a nation where people have abandoned God and even ridicule his principles. It's hard to practice devoted love and loving kindness. But here's what God is looking for. He's looking for somebody. Wouldn't somebody stand up and be a person of chesed? Wouldn't somebody stand up, because God will honor people who practice covenant faithfulness. God can take even a Moabite woman and change the direction of a nation, not only enter in a king, but if we take the story farther, we get the story of a kinsman redeemer who redeems each of us for God's kingdom because of a woman, an ordinary woman, who practiced chesed. You see, God can take an ordinary person and do the extraordinary. He's just looking for people with covenant faithfulness.